Hello everybody, I'm Rachel Leroy from Christian Emotional Recovery, and I wanted to start putting out regular videos, so here goes. Bear with me, this is a little rough and I'm using my iPhone to see how that'll work. Tell me what you think, and I'm just going to do some quick instructional videos. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this podcast was to also put out videos that are exclusive to the YouTube channel. So I encourage you to go click on the subscribe button and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And I will be trying to put out videos on a regular basis every couple of weeks, every few weeks. I do work, so I'm trying to work that in with also working on my podcast, my business, and my job, and my health. So bear with me. I am doing this kind of spontaneously. I do want to create scripts for some of the videos, but today, one of the topics that I wanted to talk about is something that if you have experienced childhood emotional neglect, other forms of childhood neglect, if you've experienced abuse of any kind that's emotional, like narcissistic abuse or childhood trauma from an adverse childhood experience or series of experiences, then you probably know something about the power of denial. And denial, I've heard a joke, is more than a river in Egypt. Denial, I have noticed, is probably one of the most toxic, destructive aspects of human existence. And what I mean by that is in marriages, in relationships, in parent-child relationships, in other types of relationships, denial is probably the number one thing that causes abuse and that causes people to end up ending a relationship because they can't reconcile it, and or because the relationship is so toxic because one or both of the people in the relationship is toxic. And sometimes it's denial that also preserves a relationship that should otherwise probably end. And reconciliation is a strong aspect of the Christian community, and I understand that. But if somebody is in denial about something, if you feel like they're being negligent or toxic or abusive or just problematic in the relationship, and you kindly bring that to their attention, and they won't even consider it, and they can't even think about it, and you've done it again and again and again and again, unfortunately, that's probably a person that you cannot reason with. And unfortunately, in those situations, if you've prayed, if you've gotten counseling, if you've talked to the person, maybe you've even talked to a mutual friend or family member who's talked to them in your behalf. And while that's not always the best thing, if you're trying to salvage a relationship, you might do whatever it takes. You know, I understand, I've been there. But if the person absolutely refuses to consider, and you've got factual proof that they've gaslighted you, and gaslighting is where they tell you something other than reality, and they may believe it too. And in other cases, they may be directly and intentionally manipulating you. I don't think everybody who gaslights you is doing it on purpose. I think a lot of times they have themselves fooled too. And we've all done it. We're all guilty of it. Just because somebody gaslights somebody doesn't mean that they're doing it intentionally or they're a bad person. It's complicated, you know? But at the same time, if somebody does it systematically, they do it all the time, you've talked to them again and again, you've tried everything that you know to try to reconcile that relationship, to tolerate the person's behavior, to have some kind of meeting of the minds somewhere in the middle, and you cannot reason with this person, and this has been going on for years. Unfortunately, in those situations, you've got a few choices. Denial, like I said, is when somebody refuses to acknowledge the harm they've done in the past, they're continuing to do it in the present, and or they're not even aware of it, possibly. And that's where narcissistic personality disorder, people that have narcissistic personality disorder literally cannot see their own flaws. They are literally incapable of it because it's unbearable for them to think of themselves as having flaws. And for any of us, it's very difficult to look at our own flaws, especially when they're pointed out by somebody close to us. And that's like, ow, you know? But if we can go to a safe place and we have time to reflect on that, sometimes we're like, yeah, you know, I need to work on that. And that's the difference between somebody who's capable of personal self-reflection. I don't think very many people in a relationship, when somebody says, you yell at me too much and you're hurting my feelings and you need to work on that, somebody's just going to be like, oh, I'm sorry. I'll work on that. Thank you so much for telling that and pointing that out to me. A very, very well-adjusted, mature person is still going to make mistakes, but they might be able to do that. The majority of us will probably be defensive if somebody brings something up to us, or if we have time to think about it, we'll be like, and we'll consider it and we'll make adjustments, and we might talk to that person or we might not. The most important thing is whether or not you work on the issue, not whether you tell the person you're going to work on it. An abuser can tell you they're going to work on it all day, but if you don't see, now they're not going to get it perfect, but if somebody's trying, you can tell they're trying, and, cut them some slack if they're not causing any direct harm. Cutting people slack, yeah. What would happen if our friends and the people that are good in our lives didn't cut us some slack? But that's different than somebody who is not even trying, somebody who's in denial and like, I don't have that problem. You're imagining things, or they try all these strategies to try to like wiggle out of it. And then even after they've had time to think about it, they keep doing the same thing. And you've done this a half a dozen, 100 times, and the person is still doing the same thing. They're in denial. Like I said, denial can be, they're lying to themselves. And in some relationships that I've had that are long-term, I've pointed certain things out to certain family members that have been harmful and negligent and been forms of abandonment. And I've said, this really hurts me. Please stop doing this. And it goes in one ear and out the other. And this has happened for decades, not years, not months, decades. And the same behavior keeps happening, and it actually continues to get worse. In relationships like that, it depends on who the relationship is with. In some cases, you may have to have some contact with the person. In other cases, you may have to go no contact because it's just so toxic. In other cases, there might be some middle ground where you just don't talk about certain things, or you gray rock them, and there are different degrees of that. And gray rocking is where you don't talk about certain topics, you remain neutral, you don't share personal information with that person, you're not vulnerable with them on any level. And like I said, that might be all the way from somebody who's extremely toxic, where it's just yes, no, hello, how are you, basic courtesies, stick to the topic, that is very neutral and nothing that's charged, to somebody where maybe you just have to not talk about certain topics at certain times, or you have to limit your time with them to some degree, but you can pretty much have a relationship with them. And so with denial, you have to look at these different ranges and see what is the best way to take care of myself in this situation. Do I need to end this relationship outright? If somebody is hurting you, they're just like cruel, vicious, manipulative, completely toxic, you can't stay in those relationships. You got to cut those relationships. And if somebody's physically harming you, sexually abusing you, emotionally abusing you in severe ways, or if it's causing you danger, imminent danger especially, you have to get out. It doesn't matter, just you got to get out, get help, and just don't stay in that situation. But as you go into these different degrees of denial and abuse that are in these relationships, it gets grayer and it gets more complicated. And so it can be difficult to decide, well, do I end this relationship? Do I gray rock this person? Do I go no contact for a while and detox from it and kind of reflect and figure out how I'm going to do this? Do I go no contact permanently? If the person shows no remorse, that's one of the steps that somebody who has harmed you has to do, or you have to do if you've harmed someone else, is there are steps to grief and recovery. There are steps to reconciling a relationship that can be salvaged. Like I said, they all cannot be salvaged, but some can. A genuine apology, if you're not sure, if you've been mistreated in subtle ways your whole life, you may not even understand whether or not the person is sincere. You may not understand whether or not their denial is something you can work with, or if it's something that you just need to completely end the relationship, or there's those middle steps. Like maybe you only see them twice a month instead of every day, or you only see them twice a year instead of every month. You see what I'm saying? You limit contact to protect yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you have to do. But if you're in a situation where you need to apologize to somebody, or somebody needs to apologize to you for abuse, mistreatment, gaslighting, neglect, or anything along those lines, emotional neglect, bear with me, I'm going to read this off my computer, but a good apology has to be sincere, and there are specific steps that it needs to include, and if it does not include most or all of these steps, then it is not a genuine apology. I was reading a book, listening to an audio, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author because it's based on religious abuse, but it applies to any form of abuse, and I'm trying to remember the name of the book. So there are two books that if you're wanting to know more about subtle abuse, I recommend a book called Healing from Hidden Abuse. It absolutely changed my life, and that's by Shannon Thompson, and she is great. I love her work. Shannon Thompson, Healing from Hidden Abuse. Another one is Something's Not Right, Decoding the Hidden Tactics of Abuse and Freeing Yourself from Its Power, and that's by Wade Mullen. Something's Not Right. And so that book, it focuses more on the subtle abuses that occur in churches and in religious organizations because it's rampant, and that's the easiest place for somebody to hide in plain sight. We won't get into why. I'm going to do a podcast on that later on, so stay tuned for that. But I just wanted to recommend those two books because they're very good in terms of how do you work out these relationships? How do you know if you should end the relationship, set boundaries, or continue the relationship? And if the person does apologize, how do you know if they're sincere or not? How do you know if it's a genuine apology? So this source that I found called eugenetherapy.com, it has 5 steps of what you need to do in order to actually have a genuine apology, and it needs to have most or all of these steps. Now, what I would say that is most important out of all steps of showing genuine remorse, of acknowledging a problem and not being in denial of it, and trying to patch up, reconcile, or heal a relationship in a genuine sense, and there are people who do it. I would argue that it's fairly rare, unfortunately, but there are people who are willing to do it. But the most important thing, are they trying consistently to make actual changes in action? Because if they are full of apologetic words and their actions do not match that, they are not sincere and they do not want to make changes. And that is a relationship you need to reconsider and really think about. You deserve to be treated with respect, kindness, consideration, and regard, and your autonomy and your agency and your individuality and free will as a human being, just as God respects ours, should be respected by anybody you're in relationship with, whether it's a fellow church member or a friend or a family member or a spouse or a significant other or anybody like that, coworkers, anything. But the steps to a sincere apology from Eugene Therapy are: first, you need to be sincere and honest in your apology, which, reading between the lines here, I would say you need to make an apology. You need to go to that person, or that person needs to go to you and say, look, here's what I did. I'm really sorry. I know this hurt you and it was wrong, and I'm apologizing and I mean it, and I hope that you'll forgive me. And that's the first step. Be sincere and honest in your apology. Number 2, express regret and remorse in your apology. If you make an apology, if the person makes an apology, but there's a lot of concessions and a lot of compromises, like, I'm sorry you feel that way, or, well, you're just being too sensitive, and maybe I did hurt your feelings. If they're hedging a lot, then they're not sincere in their apology. I'm not saying they have to do like this and grovel, but at the same time, there needs to be sincerity and validation of your experience. So they need to express genuine regret and remorse in their apology. Step 3, offer an explanation for your behavior, but not an excuse. Again, if they're hedging and making excuses like, well, what, things like that, we all have bad days, and you can say, I had a bad day, but there was no excuse for my behavior. Regardless, there was no excuse for my behavior. That's fine. That's an explanation, not an excuse. But if they're like, but you did this, or I had this happen, and then they don't qualify that with a sincere, but that's no excuse, that's not enough. Offer an explanation of your behavior, but not an excuse. So that's what they need to do next. Then they need to agree to make changes in the future. That's pretty self-explanatory. If you're asking for an apology and you're asking for changes in behavior, be explicit about what kind of changes you want to see. Ask for who, what, when, where, and how. And tell them exactly what you want them to change. And, be nice about it, of course, but tell them what you want them to change. If they can't agree to make concrete changes, maybe there's a little compromise there, but you can't be the one doing all the compromising, because then, again, they're not trying to make things right if you're doing all the compromising. If there's a little there for you, that's fine, but there needs to be negotiation where the person is genuinely interested in making things right by you. And if you're the one that hurt them, you by them. So request forgiveness from the other person. I don't know if that's necessary. There are even some situations where people change and they don't go to that person and apologize. They just change their behavior and work on themselves behind the scenes. And to me, that's more sincere than somebody who goes and profusely apologizes and they're like this, and then they just continue to do the same behavior. Even scripture says somewhere, don't quote me on this, but there's something about it's better to not make a promise and do something that's right than to make a promise and not do it, basically. And so if somebody were to make a promise and apologize and then they don't follow through on that, or even try to follow through on that, that is not a relationship that, if that keeps happening in a cycle and over and over and over again, they'll be nice for a while, they'll improve, and then they go back to their old behavior. And then it just keeps cycling through that way, like this endless mind screw. That's not okay. And then, of course, if the relationship ends, but then they start making changes on their own and they don't consult you or apologize to you, but they're making genuine changes and they're treating people right and they're working on themselves and they're looking in the mirror and taking accountability, that's actually better than the person who apologized and didn't mean it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about denial, about the harm of denial. There are a lot of angles of denial, but a little bit about denial's defense mechanism. There's a very well-mined article. Again, excuse me as I look at my computer here. But denial, is a type of defense mechanism that involves ignoring the reality of a situation to avoid anxiety. So it's not that you're a bad person or anybody's a bad person because they have denial. It's actually something that our brains use and create to keep us safe and to keep us protected. The problem is that it can harm people and it can harm relationships when we're not honest with ourselves and when we're not honest with other people. And most importantly, when we're not honest with God. If you can't be honest with anybody else, be honest with yourself and be honest with God, because that's where the healing of any relationship and any life starts. And so signs of denial: you refuse to talk about the problem. You find ways to justify your behavior. Sound familiar if you've been emotionally abused? You blame other people or outside forces for causing problems. There's always a bunch of these subsets of these too. You persist in a behavior despite negative consequences. You promise to address the problem in the future, but I would add to that, but you don't. Or you're not consistently trying to. Like I said, there's a difference between trying and failing, but you're still trying, and not trying at all. And you avoid thinking about the problem. And so I think that the basis of almost all broken relationships involves some kind of denial. And what's so sad to me is people that have all this great potential that have been damaged and traumatized often go to their graves with their bodies in disrepair and their minds in disrepair and their lives broken because they couldn't acknowledge what was going on, which is extremely painful, but it's the first step to healing. And so if somebody can acknowledge and take accountability, that's not blame. You might have been abused and have a messed up mind, and that's not your fault. I'll say it again, that is not your fault. Taking accountability does not mean you're accountable for what happened to you, or even that you're accountable for how you are hurting. It just means that you're accountable for how you choose to respond to that and how you choose to act. Just because you've been abused and this is going to sound kind of harsh, but I totally believe this. Just because you've been abused does not give you the right to be a butthead. It just doesn't. That's not an excuse. We've all hurt. You've heard the saying that hurt people hurt, but it's not an excuse to hurt other people, whether somebody's doing it to you or you're doing it to somebody else. We've all hurt somebody when we're hurting. But like I said, there's a difference between hurting and then taking your hurt out on somebody else. So you see the difference. Examples of denial is when somebody has a substance abuse problem, for example, and they are like, no, I don't have a problem. It's under control. Or if they hurt someone's feelings and they refuse to think about it and find a way to blame the other person for their behavior, that's gaslighting. And also someone experiencing symptoms of a mental health condition might avoid thinking about it. That doesn't mean you think about it every hour of the day, but just acknowledging it in general and getting help. And then after being diagnosed with a chronic or terminal illness, a person might refuse to believe the problem is as serious as it really is. That's a hard one. And that's nobody's fault, but it's still a form of denial. And it can cause a lot of hurt for the person, for the patient, and for the people that love them. So, impact of denial to me, like I said, there can be things about denial that are good, and there can be ways that when it's used temporarily, keyword temporarily, it can actually help you. For example, when I have finals week and I'm stressed out, if I'm like, I'm not stressed, I'm not stressed, I'm not stressed, I'm not stressed, I'm not stressed. If I just do that for like 3 or 4 days to get through my finals, as long as I'm taking care of myself, I'm okay. And I think that's a form of denial that's okay. But if you do that for months, your body's going to shut down and it's going to let you know, whether you like it or not, that you've got to take care of yourself and slow down. You see the difference? And so denial can actually be a healthy thing. It's also a defense mechanism when something extremely traumatic has happened, to go through the stages of grief and healing. Denial has to be the first one, because if you put the full shock of that experience in front of somebody, they would just shut down. So having denial at first and then gradually opening up to the reality of the experience very, very carefully with the help of a professional is actually healthier. So there are ways that denial can be helpful, but ways to treat denial, obviously being honest with yourself, with God, being in a place where you feel safe to be honest. And doing that in private is the first step. So think about why you were afraid to face the problem, the Very Well Mind article says. And then consider the consequences of not dealing with the problem. And then it might be losing a relationship. It might be that if you don't go get your infected foot checked out, you're gonna lose a foot. You get the idea. Consider the consequences of not dealing with the problem. That's where a lot of abusers and narcissists, their wiring in their brain is literally incapable of considering that. Consequences aren't just, oh, you're a bad person, here's the punishment. It's about cause and effect. And it's just logic. That's all it is. And then try talking to a close friend or loved one who may be able to offer honest, more objective perspectives. Only people you trust, only people who treat you with kindness and regard and respect. But talking to the people you trust can help you to get another perspective of honesty. And God, obviously talking to God is helpful too. And then work on identifying distorted thoughts that might be contributing to your anxiety. So those are some steps from Very Well Mind to help you think about denial. Think about if you're in any relationships where you might be unintentionally harming someone or neglecting someone, and where you might want to make improvements. You can do that in private. You can also ask that person, is there anything that I'm doing that it hurts you? I'm looking for honest feedback here. And say that to people who are good people who won't hurt you back. You see what I'm saying? You don't say that to an abuser, but say it to somebody that you genuinely loves you and cares about you and will treat you right. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about denial because it's something that has caused so much destruction in people's lives. And I've seen so many people go to the grave living a life they didn't have to live. And it's not something people have to go through if they're willing to take accountability and do the healing work and work on whatever they're denying in steps, gradually, gently, kindly with themselves. But thank you so much for listening to me. Check out my Patreon account. I'll list it in the show notes below the video. And subscribe. Click subscribe on the channel subscribe button. Also, check out the Facebook page, all called Christian Emotional Recovery. Check out the podcast if you haven't, also called Christian Emotional Recovery. Thank you so much for listening to this video. It has been wonderful talking to you. I'll keep putting out videos in the near future, and I look forward to this part of the platform. Thank you so much. God bless.